He and his son agreed to restore the old castle for pennies, but inside, they found not just ruins, but a secret that changed everything. See how the wind and stone gave them hope again. Subscribe, and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The castle stood high above the clouds, carved into the spine of the mountain like a crown of stone and silence. When the morning sun rose, its light broke against the gray walls and scattered in mist that never quite lifted. The locals said the wind never stopped up there, that it sang through the turrets day and night, like the breath of something ancient refusing to die. Harold Montgomery had grown so used to that sound that he could not fall asleep without it. The moan of the wind was the only companion that had remained faithful through the years, when friends, neighbors, and even family had vanished one after another into the long march of time. He had lived in the castle all his life. Once, when he was a boy, the halls had been filled with laughter and candles, the smell of roasted meat, and the clatter of boots across the flagstones. His father's voice had echoed down from the stairs, proud and stern, teaching him the weight of the family name. Montgomerys don't sell what they inherit, his father had said more than once. We guard it. But by the time Harold grew old, there was no one left to guard anything. The castle had become an enormous mausoleum, its windows cracked, its roof leaking, its corridors haunted not by ghosts, but by cold and neglect. In the small village below, people whispered about the old man who refused to leave his ruin. They said he talked to the walls, that he was waiting for someone long dead to return. They said he was too proud to accept help, too mad to sell, too stubborn to die. Harold didn't mind the rumors. He knew what they couldn't understand, that the castle was not a burden to him, but a promise. His ancestors had built it stone by stone in an age when men carved their will into the mountain, and he would not be the one to break that chain. Yet even promises lose their shape when hunger and time eat at them. His money was gone. The letters from the bank grew colder each month. The roof over the great hall had finally begun to collapse after the last winter storm. When Harold lit a fire in the hearth, smoke leaked through the cracks above and filled the room with a gray haze that made his eyes water. Still, he refused to sell. Collectors and developers sent him offers, some polite, others desperate, but he burned the letters in the same fireplace that could barely stay lit. The castle, he told himself, was worth nothing without the Montgomery soul. He spent his days moving slowly through the rooms, dusting the portraits of long-dead relatives, mending broken shutters, and whispering to himself the history of every stone. Sometimes he would stop at the window of the old study and look down at the valley. From that height, the world below looked unreal. The roads like threads, the people like ants, crawling toward something meaningless. The only thing that still felt alive to him was the wind. One afternoon, while searching the attic for nails and tools, he found an old leather notebook wrapped in a torn cloth. It belonged to his great-grandfather, Gregory Montgomery, the man who had built most of the castle and whose portrait still hung over the fireplace. The pages were covered in tight handwriting and sketches of gears, levers, and strange diagrams of wind currents swirling around the towers. Between the sketches were lines that read, "A man should leave the world stronger than he found it. Let the stones remember him." Harold traced the words with his fingers. They felt alive beneath the dust. That night, he sat by the dim fire and read until the candle burned low. His great-grandfather's voice seemed to speak through the pages, reminding him that the castle had been more than a home. It had been an experiment, a living monument to the harmony between man and nature. Gregory had written about the breathing of the mountain, about hidden chambers built to catch the wind and turn it into energy. Harold smiled sadly. "You were a dreamer too," he murmured. and for the first time in years, he felt something warm stir inside him, a spark of purpose. But purpose alone could not hold up the roof. The next morning, he took his walking stick and went down the long path into the valley. He visited every carpenter and mason he could find, asking if they would come up to help him repair the damaged sections of the castle. His voice trembled, not from pride, but from age, and his offer was small. Food, shelter, and a few coins, barely enough to buy nails. Each man he asked refused him. Some made excuses, others laughed. A few whispered that no one would work in that cursed place for any money. By evening he was exhausted, his feet ached, and his hand trembled on the stick. As he climbed the winding road back up, the wind thickened with mist, hiding the castle until it appeared suddenly above him, like a ghost rising from the mountain. He stood there, looking up at it. The roofline was jagged, the stone black with rain, the windows empty like eyes that had seen too much. He felt the sharp sting of failure. For the first time, he thought that perhaps the end had come, not just for the castle, but for the name Montgomery itself. That night, he tried to repair the roof himself. He climbed a ladder, holding planks under his arm, but his strength gave out halfway through the task. The world swayed, and he fell backward onto the frozen ground. When he woke, the morning light was thin, and his arm throbbed with pain. He could barely move. It was then that he heard footsteps on the gravel path leading to the gate. Two figures appeared through the fog, a man and a boy. The man was in his 40s, broad-shouldered but worn, his coat patched, and his hands rough from labor. Beside him walked a thin boy of about 10, holding a small hammer in one hand. They stopped at the gate and looked uncertainly at the massive doors of the castle. The boy was the first to speak. "Are you the owner, sir?" His voice was polite but full of curiosity. Harold nodded slowly. "What brings you up here?" The man took off his hat. "Name's John. This is my boy, Tommy. We heard you were looking for help." Harold studied them. Their clothes were simple, their faces honest. There was something in the boy's eyes that reminded him of his own childhood, an eagerness untouched by cynicism. "I can't pay much," he said finally. "Hardly anything at all." John shrugged. "We've slept under worse roofs than yours. If there's work, we'll take it." And so they stayed. The first days were quiet. John worked with steady patience, replacing beams and patching the walls, while Tommy carried nails, fetched water, and asked 100 questions about everything. He wanted to know who built the castle, why it was shaped like a star, why the windows were so narrow. Harold tried not to smile, but he did. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and share whatever simple meal they had. Soup, bread, sometimes a bit of cheese if the old man had it. As the days passed, Harold began to feel a strange peace. The sound of hammers and voices filled the empty halls again, and the silence that had once been his only friend now seemed less comforting than the noise of life returning. He found himself telling Tommy stories of his ancestors, how Gregory Montgomery had designed the towers to speak to the wind, how the family crest meant, through stone, we endure. The boy listened with wide eyes, as if every word were a secret meant just for him. One afternoon, Tommy climbed onto the scaffolding and looked down over the valley. "It's like we're in the sky," he said, "like the world ends here." Harold joined him, leaning on the rail. The clouds moved below them, drifting like slow rivers of white. "The world never ends," he said softly. "It just waits for someone brave enough to climb this high." That evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks, a light wind rose through the towers and hummed in the stones. For a moment, Harold could have sworn he heard laughter echo through the hall, faint and distant, like the memory of something lost long ago. The sound made him close his eyes. It was the first time in many years that the castle felt alive again. And though he did not yet know it, the arrival of the man and his boy would awaken not only the breath of the mountain, but also the secret it had guarded for more than a century. The days that followed carried a quiet rhythm that Harold had not known in years. Each morning, the sun rose pale and cold behind the eastern ridge, spilling its light over the walls that now echoed with the soft clatter of tools and the murmur of voices. John worked with steady patience, his hands rough but sure, while Tommy darted between the scaffolds like a small bird, fetching nails, holding boards, and asking endless questions that filled the castle with a strange warmth. The wind, once the only sound to accompany Harold's solitude, now mingled with laughter, footsteps, and the ring of iron against stone. Slowly, the old man began to realize that the castle no longer felt like a tomb. At first, he resisted the feeling. He told himself it was temporary, just two kind strangers passing through. Yet every evening, when they gathered by the hearth, and the boy's bright voice rose in curiosity, something inside him softened. Tommy wanted to know everything: who had carved the arches, why the ceiling curved like a ship's hull, and whether the castle had ever been part of a battle. Harold, who had spent decades avoiding the past, now found himself speaking of it with new reverence. He told the boy about Gregory Montgomery, his great-grandfather, the man who had built this fortress not only from stone, but from dreams. He believed the wind could be tamed, Harold said one night as the fire snapped and hissed, that the mountain could breathe and give something back to those who listened. Tommy leaned closer. Did he do it? Did he really make the wind work for him? Harold smiled faintly. He tried, and maybe, in his own way, he did. Every time the wind passes through these towers, I think it carries a piece of him. The boy nodded as if he understood perfectly. Later, when Harold went to check the roof repairs, he found Tommy sitting on a pile of stones with his small notebook, sketching the castle in remarkable detail. The drawings were not childish scrawls, but precise lines, arches, staircases, and chambers he could not possibly have seen. Harold paused, struck by the uncanny accuracy. "How do you know what's behind that wall?" he asked. Tommy shrugged, not looking up. "I don't know. I just see it when I think about it." Harold's heart gave a quiet tremor. The castle was old, yes, but alive in ways even he did not fully understand. For generations, Montgomery's had spoken of it as if it had memory, a living thing that whispered through its stones. Now, watching the boy draw rooms long forgotten, Harold felt that truth stirring again. A week later, after a night of heavy rain, they woke to find a section of ground near the eastern tower had sunk inward. The soil was damp and cracked, leaving a shallow pit that exposed the foundation beneath. John examined it, wiping mud from his hands. The storm must have loosened it. There's a hollow space underneath. Harold frowned. That part of the tower was sealed before I was born. They brought tools and lanterns. When John struck the earth with a shovel, a deep metallic clang echoed below, sharp and hollow. Tommy's eyes widened. "There's something down there." Together, they cleared the debris until a patch of rusted metal appeared. A door, or rather, a trap of some kind, set into the bedrock. The handle was shaped like a wheel, heavy with age. Harold knelt beside it, brushing away the mud with shaking fingers. "I've seen this before," he murmured, "in my great-grandfather's notebook." The wheel refused to turn at first, frozen by time. John fetched oil and hammered lightly around the edges, until with a groan that seemed to come from the mountain itself, the mechanism began to move. The sound was deep, ancient, almost mournful. Slowly, the wheel spun, and a narrow gap opened, exhaling a breath of air that smelled of iron and forgotten centuries. They descended carefully. The staircase wound downward, carved from stone, slick with moisture. The deeper they went, the fainter the daylight became until the lantern's glow was the only warmth in the darkness. The air felt heavy, but not dead. It vibrated faintly, as if something unseen still moved there. At the bottom lay a chamber neither of them could have imagined. It was a workshop, preserved like a secret waiting to be found. Dust coated every surface, yet nothing was broken or disturbed. Tables lined with old instruments stood against the walls, compasses, rulers, and sheets of parchment curling at the edges. In the center, beneath a canopy of rusted beams, stood a great cylindrical structure made of metal and glass, its blades shaped like petals. Tommy whispered, "It looks like a flower made of wind." Harold's knees weakened. "It's his work," he said softly. Gregory's final design. They spent hours exploring the chamber. On one table lay a series of journals, the ink faded but legible. Harold opened the first one and read aloud, his voice trembling. "They told me it was folly to chase the invisible, but I have seen power in the breath of the mountain. Wind needs no coal, no fire. It only needs a hand to guide it." Each page spoke of the same obsession, to capture the force of nature without consuming it. The diagrams revealed an early form of a turbine, far ahead of its time. Yet every note ended in disappointment, lack of funding, ridicule from scholars, the eventual sealing of the workshop. "They called it impossible," Harold said, closing the book, "so he buried it." Right here, John examined the machinery with fascination. If this could be rebuilt, he began, but his words trailed off. Harold nodded slowly. Perhaps it still can. For days they cleaned and studied the chamber, bringing down light and tools. The turbine was corroded, but the design remained brilliant. Harold found himself invigorated, his mind sharper than it had been in years. He guided John through the old drawings, explaining what little he understood, while Tommy wandered with quiet wonder, tracing his fingers over the walls, as if listening to them. One evening, while the men worked in silence, Tommy crouched beside an old chest and pulled out a bundle of letters sealed with wax. The paper was thin and brittle. He handed them to Harold. Inside were correspondences between Gregory Montgomery and a government ministry plays for funding, denials stamped with cold bureaucratic language, and finally, one letter of resignation. "They mock what they cannot see," it read, "but someday, someone will hear the same wind I hear." Harold felt tears sting his eyes. For years he had believed his family's legacy was pride and ruin. Now he saw it differently. His great-grandfather had not failed. He had simply been too far ahead. That night, as they climbed back to the surface, the wind rushed through the open shaft, playing against the old turbine's broken blades. The sound rose and deepened, turning into a low hum that filled the entire tower. It was as if the mountain itself had awakened, recognizing that its secret had finally been uncovered. At supper, they sat by the fire again, silent for a long while. Finally, John said, "You know, we could finish what he started. Maybe not on this scale, but the design's genius. If we found the right materials, the right balance, we could make it work." Harold looked into the flames. The idea was dangerous, almost blasphemous, reviving what his ancestors had been mocked for. Yet in his heart, something long dormant stirred. "No," he said at last, shaking his head. "Not we. I'm too old. But you and the boy, perhaps you can." John frowned. "I wouldn't know where to start without you." "You already have," Harold replied. "The castle let you in. It showed you what it never showed anyone else. That means something." Tommy leaned forward, his eyes bright. "We'll do it, Mr. Montgomery. I promise. We'll bring the wind back." The old man smiled faintly. "Then my family's work won't have been in vain." From that day, the tower became their shared world. They spent mornings on the roof, adjusting old vanes to measure airflow, and afternoons below, examining the remnants of the turbine. John drew blueprints on fresh paper, while Harold corrected them, his trembling hand steady when holding a pencil. Tommy kept watch, sometimes drawing strange diagrams of his own, patterns that made sense only to him, but that Harold could not dismiss. When the villagers in the valley heard of their efforts, they laughed. "The old man's gone mad again," they said. "Now he's teaching the wind to work." Harold heard the rumors, but didn't care. For the first time in decades, he was not trying to preserve the past. He was helping it evolve. As autumn deepened, the air turned colder, sharper. The mountain began to whisper louder at night, its breath filling the corridors like a distant song. Harold lay awake in his bed, listening. Sometimes he thought he heard words hidden in the wind, echoes of Gregory's defiance. Let them laugh. The mountain remembers. One morning, while the mist still hung thick around the towers, Harold found Tommy standing at the base of the staircase that led down to the hidden chamber. The boy looked thoughtful. "I think it wants to breathe again," he said softly. "The mountain?" Harold asked. Tommy nodded. "It's waiting for us to open it." Harold placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then we will. Together." That evening, they lit every lantern in the underground room. The air shimmered faintly as the flames flickered, casting reflections off the metal pedals of the turbine. John turned the first crank, and the blades groaned, moving half an inch, then another. The wind that seeped through the open shaft caught them, and for the briefest moment, the machine began to spin. Not fast, not powerful, but alive. The noise that followed was like a sigh, long and deep, resonating through the stone walls. Harold closed his eyes. He could feel it vibrating in his chest, the heartbeat of something reborn. The wind was breathing again. When the motion finally slowed and stopped, silence fell heavy, yet peaceful. Harold looked at the boy and the man beside him. "Don't stop now," he said. "You've just heard what my family spent a century trying to hear. Finish it, no matter how long it takes." John nodded solemnly. "We will." Tommy smiled, his eyes shining in the lantern light. "It's like the castle woke up," he whispered. And as they climbed back toward the surface, the wind followed them up the stairs, winding around their legs and arms like an invisible spirit. It carried with it the faintest echo of something almost like gratitude, as if the mountain itself had thanked them for remembering. Above, the sky had cleared. The moon rose over the jagged peaks, bright and round, lighting the walls of the castle that now seemed taller, stronger, and more alive than ever before. Harold stood on the balcony and listened as the wind moved through the towers, humming the same low note he had heard in his childhood. It no longer sounded lonely. It sounded awake. Winter came early that year. The mountain turned white, its slopes buried under layers of snow that glittered like crushed glass in the pale sunlight. The wind grew stronger, colder, its song rising through the stone corridors of the castle like a slow hymn. Harold listened to it from his bed, where he now spent most of his days. His hands had grown too weak to hold tools, his legs too frail to climb the tower stairs. Yet his eyes remained sharp and alive whenever John or Tommy entered the room. They would bring reports of their progress, sometimes just to sit with him and talk about the day's work. The castle, once silent and empty, now echoed with life again. Footsteps, laughter, the sound of saws and hammers. For Harold, every sound was a heartbeat. He knew he did not have much time left. His body, like the old beams above him, had begun to creak and give way. But there was peace in him now, a calm that came not from resignation, but from completion. The secret beneath the tower had been found, and the legacy that had nearly died with him had taken new breath in the hands of others. Sometimes, as the wind passed through the chimneys and filled the room with its whisper, he could almost hear Gregory's voice, the same voice that spoke from the old notebooks, telling him that the castle was never meant to end with one man. John came to his bedside one evening, his coat dusted with snow, his face lined with exhaustion, but brightened by a quiet pride. "The repairs are nearly done," he said, sitting down on the chair beside him. "We've sealed the east wall, reinforced the beams, and rebuilt the roof. It might stand another 100 years now." Harold smiled faintly. "That's longer than I need it to stand." "You'll see it finished," John said, though his voice carried doubt he couldn't hide. Harold shook his head. "No, but that's all right. I've seen enough to know it's in the right hands. My father built this place to keep the family name alive. But you," he paused, his breath shallow, "you've given it something my family never could. You've given it purpose again." John looked down at his rough hands. "It's your purpose, Harold. We're just following your lead." The old man's eyes drifted toward the window, where the snow swirled outside in slow, endless spirals. "No," he said softly. "You're following the wind, and that's exactly what Gregory wanted." In the days that followed, Tommy spent most of his time in the workshop beneath the tower. He was tireless, curious, endlessly fascinated by every gear and lever. He and his father had managed to reconstruct part of the turbine, cleaning the blades and rebuilding the mechanism with scrap metal found in the village. It was crude, imperfect, but when the wind came through the shaft, the blades turned, and a hum filled the chamber, a hum that seemed to vibrate through every stone of the castle. Harold could feel it even from his bed. It was faint at first, then stronger, like the slow heartbeat of a giant waking from sleep. One morning, he asked John to take him down to the tower one last time. They carried him carefully in a chair, wrapped in blankets, his face pale, but his eyes alert. As they descended into the lower corridors, the air grew warmer, touched by the heat of lanterns and the scent of oil and iron. When they reached the chamber, the turbine stood before them, no longer a relic of rust and dust, but a living structure of metal and motion. Its blades spun lazily, catching the currents that slipped down from above. Harold gazed at it for a long time. "It's beautiful," he whispered. He would have been proud. Tommy stood beside him, his hands still smudged with grease, his cheeks red from excitement. "It's not finished yet, Mr. Montgomery, but it's working. The mountain's breathing again." The old man reached out, resting a trembling hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then you've done what none of us could. You've given the mountain its voice back." He looked at John. "Promise me you'll keep it alive. Promise me this won't end with me." John nodded solemnly. "I promise." That night, Harold didn't speak much. He sat in his chair near the fire, staring into the flames that danced against the stone walls. Tommy dozed nearby, and John repaired a broken lantern. The old man's breathing grew shallow, but his expression was peaceful. When he finally closed his eyes, a soft smile lingered on his lips. By dawn, the castle's caretaker was gone. The news spread quietly through the valley. A few villagers climbed the path to offer condolences, but John met them at the gate and thanked them without inviting them in. The castle was not a place for mourning. It was a place that had already said its goodbyes 100 times before. Instead of holding a funeral, John and Tommy buried Harold near the eastern wall, beneath a cluster of pine trees that overlooked the valley. They placed a simple stone over the grave with no inscription, only a small carving of a spiral, like the curl of wind. After that, the castle stood silent for several days. The tools lay untouched, the fires burned low, and the mountain seemed to hold its breath. Then, one morning, as the first light touched the peaks, Tommy rose early and went to the workshop alone. He lit the lanterns, checked the gears, and climbed the stairs to the roof. The air was clear and sharp, and the wind moved steadily through the towers. He looked down at the valley below, then up at the sky, and whispered, "It's time." When John joined him later that day, he found the boy standing beside a strange contraption mounted on the highest turret, a smaller version of the turbine, assembled from the same blueprints, but modified with Tommy's own ideas. The blades were lighter, the structure balanced on a new pivot system. "You built this yourself?" John asked, astonished. Tommy nodded. "I used what Mr. Montgomery taught us. The wind up here is stronger. It can turn faster." Before John could protest, a gust swept across the ridge. The blades caught it and began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, until the entire tower vibrated with motion. From below came the deep, resonant hum of the larger turbine answering in kind. The sound spread through the castle, echoing in the halls, shaking the dust from rafters that had not moved in decades. The mountain seemed to awaken once more. For a long time, John and his son stood side by side, watching the turbines spin. The wind pressed against their faces, cold but clean, carrying the scent of snow and pine. John's eyes stung, though not from the cold. "He'd have loved this," he said quietly. Tommy smiled. "He's here. I can feel it." In the weeks that followed, John began writing letters to engineers and universities, describing the design they had uncovered and the modifications they had made. Most didn't reply. A few dismissed the idea outright, calling it fanciful. But one letter returned with interest, from a small institute that specialized in renewable energy. They sent a team to see the invention for themselves. The day they arrived, the castle looked almost new again. The walls were patched and clean, the roof whole, the floors swept of dust. The turbines turned steadily above, their hum constant and strong. The scientists marveled at the mechanism, at the ingenuity of a century-old design made real by 3 generations of dreamers. They took notes, measurements, and photographs, and when they left, they promised to return. Months passed. Snow melted into spring. Grass grew over Harold's grave, and flowers began to bloom between the stones. One morning, a package arrived inside it, a certificate and a letter of recognition from the Institute, naming the invention the Montgomery wind engine, and crediting both its original creator and its modern restorers. There was even a small grant attached, enough to fund the construction of new turbines in the nearby village. John read the letter aloud, his voice breaking at the words. "They did it, Tommy. They finally see it." The boy looked up at the spinning blades, his eyes full of pride. Now everyone will hear the mountain. Years later, the castle became known not as a ruin, but as a beacon. Travelers came to see the place where a forgotten invention had been reborn. Engineers studied it, artists painted it, and the villagers who once called it cursed now spoke of it with reverence. The wind that turned its turbines powered the first lights in the valley, bringing warmth and hope to homes that had long depended on candles and fire. John and Tommy never left. They built a small workshop near the base of the tower and continued their work, refining the design, teaching others how to harness the same invisible strength. On quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low behind the peaks, they would sit on the balcony where Harold had once stood and listen to the hum of the turbines, blending with the voice of the wind. Tommy often imagined the old man beside them, leaning on his cane, smiling as he watched the blades spin. He liked to think that somewhere, beyond the clouds, Gregory Montgomery and his descendant were listening too, proud that their legacy had found new hands to carry it forward. As years turned into decades, the castle remained, its stones weathered, but strong, its towers still catching the breath of the mountain. The villagers called it the castle that breathes, and those who climbed the winding path to see it swore that, if they stood quietly, they could hear something in the hum of the wind-like voices speaking from another time, carried through the centuries. One evening, long after the sun had disappeared, Tommy stood alone on the highest balcony, now a man grown but still with the same light in his eyes. The turbines turned above him, and the air trembled with sound. He closed his eyes and whispered the words Harold had spoken so long ago. If the walls stand, the memory lives. And if the memory lives, the home never dies. Then he smiled, listening to the wind answer. The mountain was breathing still, and somewhere within that breath lived the spirit of everyone who had ever believed that stones could remember, and that the past, if treated with care, could shape the future. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next one, and share this video with someone who still believes that memories can live in stone.